Good morning, everyone. Deacon Ed McCormick here. Although I was not assigned to preach this weekend, I was moved by this week's gospel, especially the parable of the weeds and wheat and the death of John Lewis. And I was moved by the Lord to share a few thoughts with you regarding this parable and John Lewis's life. It was this Friday, July 17th, that John Lewis, a crucial figure in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the conscience of the Congress, died. He lived a life as wheat among weeds. And to appreciate all this man has contributed to the moral and social life of our country, I encourage you to watch the civil rights series, The Eyes on the Prize, and also to buy and read the 3-volume graphic novel that John Lewis wrote about his life. It's a great read, it's an easy read, also a great gift for kids and teens. Now last week, if you remember, Jesus spoke about the parable of the sower, where he challenged us to see that God is sowing the seeds of the kingdom in our lives and in our world. And we were challenged to be the good soil, where the seeds of God's justice and love and peace could be grown. And John Lewis and his life was that good soil. This week, Jesus tells us a parable about a farmer who sows wheat and how his enemy sows weeds. And he's warning us. He's warning us not to pull up the weeds with the wheat and the wheat with the weeds. In Jesus' day, there were groups like the Zealots who wanted to use violence to tear out the weeds that they saw to be the Romans and others that were not living a faithful Jewish life. And Jesus was cautioning them about such a violent response because violence grows more weeds. It doesn't pull them out. And John Lewis, in his nonviolent witness, knew that violence grows weeds and nonviolence grows wheat. So Jesus reminds us that in our world and in our lives, in our hearts and minds, weeds and wheat, they grow together in us, in our church, and certainly in our society. Yes, he assures us that God is growing the wheat of his kingdom, the wheat of justice and peace and love and truth. But this is happening in a world where the weeds of racism and greed and lies and hate are opposed to God's coming kingdom. You see, what wheat does is it exposes the weeds that seek to choke the growing wheat. What wheat does is it grows side by side the weeds inside us and around us, making clear what the weeds look like. And John Lewis knew this. He lived this. John Lewis grew up living as wheat among weeds. He was kingdom wheat among the weeds of racism and segregation, growing up as a young man where no African American had the vote, where lynching was common, where racism was brutal and found everywhere. He grew up in a world that sought to strangle the life out of black folks. He grew up as wheat among weeds. As a young college student, John Lewis joined what was known as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he and other college students, both black and white, protested the segregated lunch counters found throughout cities in the South. In these lunch counters, only whites were served. People of color could not get a lunch at any lunch counter in the South. Woolworths was a famous place where these lunch counters existed. And so John Lewis and other college students led a non-violent sit-in at these lunch counters. They would sit at a white-only lunch counter and ask to be served. And of course they were told no. And soon crowds would come to mock them and pouring sugar and salt on them, smacking them and beating them. But their nonviolent protest quickly led to the opening of these lunch counters to all people. He was acting as kingdom wheat among weeds. In 1964, John boarded a bus with other young people, black and white, to protest segregated busing and bus terminals in the South that had whites-only lobbies. These were known as the Freedom Rides. And as these Freedom Riders on these buses rode into the South and stopped at one bus terminal after another, they would go into the whites-only bus terminal, and crowds gathered, violent crowds gathered, attacking them, attacking the buses. At one point, a bus was burned. Crowds brutally beat some of these people, sending them into the hospital. John Lewis and the Freedom Riders were sowing wheat among violent weeds. In 1965, John Lewis and a large crowd of civil rights activists gathered in Selma, Alabama, and they marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And as they're walking across this bridge with John Lewis in the front, they find a line of state troopers blocking their way with guns and batons. And as John Lewis and the other civil rights marchers kneel down to pray, the troopers stream onto them, start beating them, attacking them, sending Lewis to the hospital with a fractured skull as he tried to live as wheat among weeds. Jesus' parable and the life of John Lewis ask us, are we growing wheat or weeds? Remember, during the Civil Rights Movement, many Catholics opposed the Civil Rights Movement. They acted more like poisonous weeds than like wheat. So today, we are being asked by the Lord to be that good soil, to be people that grow wheat. When he was in Congress all those years as a representative for Georgia, John Lewis continued to work to grow the seeds of truth and justice and peace. Even as people were trying to suppress the vote, and this is today, my friends, even as people are trying to suppress the vote, John Lewis fought for voting rights, for the expansion of voting rights. As racial justice and police brutality against African Americans was found throughout the country, he was pushing for racial justice. He fought for health care for all as the weeds sought to take away people's health care. He fought for just wages as the weeds of greed sought to keep the poor poor. So the question for us today, posed by this parable in John Lewis's life, is what are you growing in your garden that is your life? Today we've seen courageous women speak out about the sexist culture in our local DC football team. These women were acting as wheat among weeds. Today we're watching peaceful protesters challenge racism and police brutality. They're acting as wheat among weeds. And even when there are looters and rioters, very few of them, though there are, these peaceful protesters are sowing wheat among weeds. So my friends, the question that Jesus asks us today is, are you good soil? Are you a place where I can sow my wheat of justice and love and peace? In our relationships, in our workplaces and schools, I pray that we can become wheat among weeds. In our hearts and in our minds, I pray that the wheat grows and the weeds die out. So what are you growing in your garden? Amen.